Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In our episode of 10 Questions, today we do the Mongols, the last ride of the nomadic Horselords. So, our first question that we're going to start with is not a geography question, which I guess is kind of unusual, but it's a symbolic question. What do the Mongols represent? And what they represent is the last great conquest of nomadic peoples against settled peoples. The kind of theme of this course has been the expansion of settled people at the expense of nomadic peoples. Even though at the very start of this course, we talked about how nomadic peoples with horses had advantages, and how it took the building of walls and the creation of kings and all kinds of innovations in order for settled people to just survive in a world dominated by nomadic horse peoples. And how from time to time, the Bronze Age collapse, the coming of the Persians, that nomadic horse people still defeated settled peoples, still won from time to time. And the Mongols are the last kind of great victory of nomadic peoples over settled peoples. It is the apex of the nomadic horse armies. That the Mongols will create, despite having a relatively small population, the largest land empire in history. And it will stretch from eastern China all the way to Central Europe. So why? How did the Mongolians win so much? How was that possible? Well, they have a unique combination of discipline, loyalty, and generalship in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a period where armies, especially in, say, Europe, were individualized, unorganized. Kings were not generals. Kings kind of led an army to a battlefield and then said, charge. And then knights or horsemen or the infantry or archers kind of did what they wanted to do. There may be a little more control of this, but this is not Alexander. This is not Caesar. These are armies that slug it out in the mud. And once the battle begins, there's not a lot of generalship. There's not a lot the king can do to move armies around the battlefield, to move units around the battlefield. The Mongolian army could do that with the clever use of flags and a discipline and a loyalty to the general, to the leader, to the Khan. The Mongolian army looked like a modern army in a medieval world. It also had multiple forms of combat. Most of the army was archers, but they also had a significant lancer contingent, which means they could fight infantry. Lancers can charge into people, where the archers, on the other hand, can feint, can attack and withdraw, can just wear down, especially if it's an infantry army without any kind of cavalry to protect it. They could just wear it down. And so the Mongols were able to fight multiple forms of combat. The general on the battlefield was able to command units to move around the battlefield to exploit spaces. They operated like a modern army, even though it was the 1200s. Why did they use foreigners? Because, okay, the Mongols could beat up people on a battlefield, but we know from the beginning of time, settled people don't fight nomads on the battlefield. Settled people hide in their walls. They hide in their cities with their food, and they kind of wait for the nomads to go away. So, how are the Mongols able to conquer China, the Silk Road of Central Asia, Khorasan, the Middle East, the Ukraine, Kiev, Russia? How are they able to do that? And the answer is the use of foreigners. So, how and why? Well, the Mongols, unlike most peoples, were willing to hire foreigners into their army. The Mongols know that they don't know how to capture cities. They know that they can't get off their horses and charge into the walls of a city. That's the worst use of cavalry. You don't get off your horse. And so they were willing to hire foreigners to add to their knowledge base. They're willing to add other Mongolian tribes. Remember, as nomadic horse people, Genghis Khan's tribe mostly fights other Mongolian tribes. They mostly fight other nomads. It's only when kind of a charismatic leader kind of unites them that they go and charge into North China or down into Central Asia or head west into the Middle East. Other Mongolian tribes are, for the most part, foreigners. And yet, Genghis Khan is willing to do that. He's kind of willing to do that because the start of the empire, the start of Genghis Khan, starts with him being defeated. He was a member of a tribe that got wiped out by another tribe. His wife got carried off to become the wife of another man. Genghis Khan was left for dead and recovering vowed vengeance. He ended up joining a third tribe that welcomed him in, and he was so charismatic, such a leader, that he basically took over the tribe. People wanted to follow him. Remember, we talked about how this is possible for nomadic horse people's government because it was personal. It wasn't institutional. So if people wanted to follow you, people followed you. And Genghis Khan will get revenge. He will conquer that other tribe. He will wipe out that other tribe. He will get his wife back. So from the very beginning, Genghis Khan's kingdom, empire, will involve absorbing other Mongolian tribes. And then they'll ally with and absorb Turkish-speaking nomadic tribes, who usually they fight with. But, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so if the Turkish-speaking nomads are having fights with the Jin dynasty of China or the cities of Central Asia, hey, we can ally with that. And so that makes the tribe from 1,000 or 2,000, 3,000 people into, now you're adding more tribes. Now you've got a significant army, an army capable of defeating settled people's armies on the battlefield, 30, 40,000 people. But what about the cities? What about, now you have to do siege warfare. All right, the horses can run around cities, run around the outskirts of them and steal stuff. But you can't capture a city on horseback. It's not going to work. You need siege engines. You need an army that can stay, that can bring in food, that can lay siege, that could tear down those walls. Well, people who live in tents don't know anything about that. And so they are willing to hire Han Chinese engineers and then later Persian engineers to help them capture Chinese and Muslim cities. They're willing to hire the best and the brightest, despite them not being Mongolian or even their cousins, the Turks. They're willing to hire settled peoples to help them defeat settled peoples. And you may go, why would settled peoples do this? Well, if they're paying well, you're always going to find people who do it. Oh, you mean you're going to give me $1 million and I just have to help you destroy, a city I've never been to and don't care about? Sure. You'll always find people who are willing to do it for the money, for a better life, for being treated well. You know, the Turks, the Ottoman Turks' leading gun designer was a Hungarian Christian who was helping them defeat the Byzantines, a fellow Christian country. So people do this all the time. You know, if you can get a better life and the people are going to treat you well, sure. Okay, so the engineers give you that knowledge, but now you have to lay siege to a city. You have to dig underneath the walls. You have to go up the walls. You have to try to tear down the walls. That takes a lot of people. And those people take a lot of casualties. The Mongols don't want to do that. The Mongols will go charge it in once the walls come tumbling down, once a big hole in the wall opens up, right? Henry V in Shakespeare, right? Let loose the dogs of war, you know, charge the hole, charge the wall, and let loose the dogs of war, or fill the hole up with our English dead. Right. For this, the Mongolians were using slave labor. They were willing to keep you alive if you were willing to lay siege to cities, to dig the trenches, dig the moats, use the battering rams. They weren't Mongolian. They weren't going to be citizens in the Mongolian or leading citizens of the Mongolian Empire. The engineers got treated well because they had this specialized knowledge. But the slave labor is basically cannon fodder. Now, if you survived, could you get your freedom and kind of move up, you know, to become something? Yeah, possibly. Sure. The Mongols respected toughness. The Mongols respect war. The reason why you're a slave is you surrendered or you got defeated in war. So if you could prove yourself again, sure, why not? Crazier things have happened. But they were using the slave labor as cannon fodder, as, you know, if they die, no big deal. If they win, all right, good for them. So what form of legitimacy did the Mongols use? Well, they used terrorism. Flat out terrorism. They're going to murder 30 million Chinese. Sack the entire Islamic world except for Egypt. Obliterate the Silk Road cities like Samarkand and Merv. Stacking heads in pyramids, just cutting off the heads of people and stacking them into large pyramids. In 1258, they sacked Baghdad and looted it and burned it. So many books were in the Tigris. The story is you had a bridge you could walk across without getting your feet wet. That's how many books were thrown into the river. They burned Kiev to the ground in 1240. The sack of Baghdad traumatized the Arabs, traumatized Islam. The Arabs recede, become xenophobic, stop being the leading Islamic people in the world. The destruction of Kiev in 1240 obliterates essentially the Kievan kingdom, allowing kind of Moscow and Russia to rise in its place. So today you have Vladimir Putin saying there is no Ukraine. Ukraine is Russia. Well, how can he talk about that way? What do you mean it's the same? They're the same people. You know, how can he say that? Because it goes back to what the Mongols did to Kiev. By destroying Kiev, it created this vacuum that Moscow, that the northern Russian peoples would eventually fill. That vacuum they would fill. And so in the 1650s through the 1700s, not the Ukraine, because the Russians will call it the Ukraine, but Ukraine is conquered. Kiev is brought back under, I'm using the Russian version of the history, right? Kiev is absorbed by Moscow, by the Russians. It hadn't been. It wasn't part of it. But Moscow crushed this Kievan Slavic state. So part of the reason we have a war in 2022, 2023 is because of what the Mongols did in 1240. Think about that. When you say, oh, I don't care about history, well, you're living it. You might not care about history, but history cares about you. So what is the result? If they're terrorists, what is the result of wherever the Mongols go? And the answer is poverty, destruction. The cities of the Silk Road are destroyed. The infrastructure of trade is ripped up. All of those small towns, all those cities along the way, all that water, all those markets are gone. War, famine, starvation, even the Black Death, which the Mongols were willing to spread to the cities in the Crimea. The Mongols shot bodies, infected bodies over the walls at the Genovese. One reason that the Black Death starts spreading in Italy is because of the biological warfare the Mongols were waging against Italian colonies in Crimea, in Ukraine. The Persian population is going to drop by 2 million. Baghdad itself was 1 million people dead. As we talked about, the books destroyed from Baghdad built a bridge over the Tigris. The destruction of the Seljuk Turks broke Turkish unity up for a century. They leveled Kiev, ended the Kievan Empire, the rise of Moscow. The Hungarian population declined by half. And that's at the end, the farthest end of the empire, of the Mongolian Empire. They don't hold on to Hungary and Central Europe for very long, and they still declined. The Hungarian population declined by half. So wherever they go is poverty, is destruction. So what about China? Well, China is first conquered, first northern China, and then southern China. And Kublai Khan makes the Yuan dynasty, the Mongolian dynasty, where he takes China and he absorbs it into Mongolia. This is traumatizing and humiliating for China. China had warred. China had been overrun at times by nomadic horse peoples, but now it lost its independence. It was part of someone else's empire. And that is a trauma and a humiliation. Basically becomes part of Han culture. They never want to be conquered by foreigners again. This is part of the modern President Xi's call for a strong China. His history goes back, yes, to what's called the century of humiliation, the 100 years where Europeans beat up on China. And the Chinese emperors couldn't do much about it, couldn't stop it, and sometimes actively participated in it. But Chinese history, Chinese memory goes much farther back than that. And it goes back to here, to the Mongols. We're being conquered again. Well, the Ming dynasty that will overthrow the Yuan dynasty builds a great wall, ends foreign trade, creates a China for the Chinese. They want to keep the world out. That tells you all you need to know. They build a 1,000-mile wall. They build a giant wall to form a border between them and the north. They end their foreign trade. They want to keep the world out. What about the effect of the Mongolian conquest on Korea? Well, depopulation, deurbanization, and poverty. The difference between Korea and China is that China was huge and rich. And Korea while successful, was small. And so the effects on Korea are way or worse because the Mongolians, Kublai Khan had a reason, had a purpose in rebuilding China. And China being destroyed, he did have a purpose, an incentive to make China make money again. He was running it. Korea, on the other hand, is this little peninsula to the east. Yeah, we'll run it, but who cares about it? And so you have depopulation, deurbanization, poverty. You get the loss of native Buddhism, the decline of native Buddhism, and the increase in Chinese Confucian philosophy. Why? Why import Chinese Confucian philosophy? Well, the Yuan dynasty wants to use Confucian philosophy to tell you not to revolt. So you have a Chinese colonization in a way. Not with people, but with philosophy. And what this does is ties Korea's success to northern China, where this is going to be true until, this is going to be true until independence to the 1950s. North Korea's success is still tied to northern China. So that's still going on. But if like the Ming are strong, Korea will be successful. If the Ming are weak, then Korea gets invaded by, say, the Manchus. If the Manchus are strong, Korea is doing well. When the Qing dynasty, when the Manchu dynasty declines, the French show up. Japan shows up and colonizes Korea, attacks it and colonizes it, takes it over, colonizes it. So for the next several hundred years, Korea is going to be economically dependent on China because the Mongols are going to basically rip up, destroy much of its independent economic systems. And this is a problem for Korea because it's too far from the Silk Road to benefit from global trade. The Ming are going to shut down sea trade, so that's not going to help Korea. The ocean trade is not going to help Korea. In fact, because the Ming shut down ocean trade, the waters around China and Korea become dominated by Japanese pirates. So Korea can't make any money by ocean trade. And with the shutdown of the Silk Road, by its destruction and then by the Ming, Korea can't make any money from global trade. So Korean philosophy and politics and diplomacy and its own protection become completely dependent on the success or failure of northern China, of whatever dynasty is running northern China. What about the Mongolian invasion on Japan? Well, Japan is not conquered. It is a near-death experience. And that near-death experience, just like we talked about with the near-death experience of Constantinople to the Arabs, profoundly changes the culture of the people who survive. It is a major invasion. The Mongols took the Chinese Navy, the Korean Navy, took Chinese troops. They made Korea basically pay for the invasion. Korea would be bankrupt after the two invasions. And so it's basically all of East Asia's resources thrown at Japan. The Mongols and China and Korea. And Japan is saved by the kamikaze, the divine wind, a monsoon, a typhoon that smashes, that arrives. Remember, people can't predict stuff. They didn't know this typhoon was coming across the Pacific, going to hit Japan. So it just arrives in like the nick of time. It just arrives as the Mongols are invading. It destroys the fleet. It pushes the Mongols back to Korea. It saves Japan. The effect of that, the cultural effect of that, was that Japan begins to see itself as a chosen people. You mean all of East Asia was thrown against us and we still won? We must be the most awesome people in the whole wide world. Certainly, the gods, the divine will, saved us. We are the chosen people. Now, the effect of that concept is the idea that to be safe, you had to be better. It was too close. You couldn't sit on your laurels. You couldn't say, the gods think we have chosen us, and then sit there and do nothing, and then wait for them, the Mongols, to come back. So you had to prepare. You had to be better. And so that leads to this need for local coastal defense, which leads to the empowerment of local lords. Japan at this time did not have a strong emperor. It had a shogunate. It had a general-in-chief. And what ends up with is, instead of an imperial army, an imperial navy, a government with the legitimacy of the emperor capable of modernizing Japan in a way that would defend it and unify it. Instead, what you got is essentially feudal Europe. You got the localization of power to local lords, the samurai, who then taxed their peasants in order to build their own private forces. That leads actually to the fall of the shogunate. And then the replacement by the weak emperor, and then a weaker military court. A weaker, like, little shogunate. Because the shogunate in charge is like, wait a minute, whoa, I didn't know you all were going to make your own little armies. You got to stop that. And they're like, well, we got them now. And we have to have them to protect the coast, our provinces, from the Mongols if the Mongols ever come back. And so you have a short civil war over, or is the shogunate going to run the show, or are these local lords going to be independent? And the victory is the local lords. This is not exactly what happens in Europe, but this is very similar to what happens in the Holy Roman Empire when the Vikings arrive. You get the empowerment because the Holy Roman Imperial Army couldn't protect Western Europe and all the places that the Vikings were attacking. The effect was local lords built their own private armies and gained power. And so you have a weak king of France, a weak king in Germany of the Holy Roman Empire. And that's what happens in Japan. You have this weak leadership, weak central government, and the local lords, the samurai, become empowered for the next couple hundred years. So Japan effectively breaks up. Korea becomes dependent. Japan breaks up. China turns in on itself. Well, what effect does the Mongolian conquest have on the Middle East and Islam? It's devastation. It is just 4,000 years of irrigation is just ripped up. I mean, the Middle East goes from being, Mesopotamia goes from being one of the richest places we've talked about. We talk about it in every chapter in History 101. In History 102, we are barely going to touch it because it becomes impoverished. It becomes poor. It's the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. It's the decline of the Arabs. Egypt survives, interestingly enough. Egypt's just a little too far across the desert. The Mameluke army is the first one who's able to defeat the Mongols. Egypt survives independently. The Seljuk Turkish Empire is broken up, is smashed like with a sledgehammer and breaks into about, whatever it is, 100 pieces. That will allow for the rise of the Ottoman, the Osman's tribe, who will unify the Turks. But that wasn't certain. At this point, it's possible for the Byzantines to come back, to re-Christianize Asia Minor, to convert the Turks. Anything at this point was kind of possible. The history of the Turks basically ended and had to be reboot. That's what the Mongols did. The Mongols are going to form a kingdom called the Ilkhanate, which is, I think it's basically means the lesser kingdom, the lesser khanate, the minor khanate. And the idea of that was there's the great Khan in Mongolia, and that will become Kublai Khan in the series of civil wars. Kublai Khan will unite Mongolia and northern China together, and he'll kind of take over that title. The Ilkhanate is kind of allied in the wars of the grandsons. The Ilkhanate of Persia is kind of allied to Kublai Khan and China against the other grandson kingdoms. And so the Ilkhanate is this Mongol kingdom that leads Persia. It will control Mesopotamia. It will control Afghanistan and the Indus, and parts of Central Asia. But its basis is Persia, is Iran. So it's a Mongol-led, Persian-based Islamic empire. And the Mongols over time become Muslim, which of course puts them on a fighting course with Kublai Khan, who's becoming, of course, Chinese, becoming Confucian and Buddhist. But the Khanate falls apart by about 1350. It relied on pure Persian bureaucrats to create an Iranian state. So interestingly, unlike in China, the leading government is going to be the locals. The Ilkhanate hired the locals to run the show. So while it's Mongolian controlled, what the Persian bureaucrats are creating is an Iranian Persian kingdom, because it's going to be run by them, right, at the local level. And so that influences the language and the culture and the architecture of Central Asia and India, because the Ilkhanate is also importing ideas from Kublai Khan, from the Yuan dynasty. There is this cultural transmission. And so what you get is like the Taj Mahal. Now, the Taj Mahal is built by the Mughals. Later, it's not built by the Mongol Ilkhanate. It's built by the Mughals, who claim kind of a heritage to the Mongols. But the idea of the Taj Mahal is that it's Persian. It's this combination of Persian and Central Asian and Mongolian and Chinese. It's this combination of this stuff. That's where you get the giant domes, the Persian domes, where it's Aqaba in Aladdin, is the Ilkhanate's, the latter Ilkhanate's architecture. And so you get this mixture of all these different cultures. There's a bit of Arab in it. There's Central Asian, like Uzbek and Tajik. There's a bit of Indian. Muslim Indian for the most part. That's the Indus River. But, in the Indian subcontinent, these are Indians who happen to be Muslim. Some Pashtun and Punjabis. You get all of this mixture together. But politically, the Ilkhanate kind of falls apart. So while it has a huge cultural effect, politically it collapses in on itself, allowing for actually the rise of Tamerlane, who's going to conquer it. But Tamerlane never really runs anything. He wants to conquer the world, and so he goes from conquering Persia to the Middle East. He beats up the Turks. He beats up the Ottoman Turks. He turns around. He conquers the Delhi Sultanate and the Indus of India, and then he's going to go off to China, and that's when he dies. Like he's just like a cannonball bouncing off everything. He doesn't run his empire, and so it kind of falls apart after him. So here's the great question, and this is the question that you like. This is the essay question, right? Were the Mongols good or bad for history? Now, I know you're going to say, it's both. But if you want to get an A on a test, on an essay, you can't say they're both. You have to pick. You have to go with one. But see, I'm not writing an essay. I'm not making the argument. I'm giving you knowledge. So I'm going to go with the bad and the good. And the bad is they completely wrecked places. China, Slavic Europe, the Arabs, the Central Asian cultures. They wrecked world trade. They used slave labor. They have massive population distortions. They picked up maybe millions of people and moved them from the Middle East to Mongolia, or from the Middle East to China, and from China to Central Asia. And they moved people from Europe, from the Slavic world into the Arab world, and they massive population distortions. They spread the Black Death. They spread the Great Plague, which killed off. The scientific number is somewhere around 40% of Eurasia's population. Higher in the cities, lower in the countryside. But the Great Plague is going to murder 40% of Europe, 40% of Central Asia, 40% of China. China's population declines by 30 million. 30 million people. So the world as it existed when the Mongols come storming out of the Gobi Desert doesn't exist anymore. Like there's a book that's like, I don't know, Genghis Khan or the Mongols and the making of the modern world. Like there's a lot of books who have terrible titles, and I'm like, oh, this is just wrong. Like their thesis is just wrong. Like nomads were peaceful and you got to live eating apples all day on 20 minutes of work. Like, no, that's not how it worked. But that the Mongols create the modern world, there's an argument to be made about that. But they made the modern world by wrecking the world that existed before it. Nobody who gets conquered by the Mongols is better off for it. They may recover. They may build, like the Ming or the Persians, a new civilization on top of it. But no Persian or Chinese person alive was happy the Mongols arrived. Their lives did not get better unless you were literally working for the Mongols as a traitor against your own people. If you were an ordinary person when the Mongols arrived, it was the apocalypse. It was the book of Revelations. So then how could any of this be good? The good is in when the Mongols stop conquering and they start running places. And the good was they allowed the mixture of cultures. China was now directly connected to India and the Middle East, to Europe. Knowledge is transferred and transformed. Persians are in China. China tech is in Persia. Gunpowder, which the Chinese invented, follows the Mongols all the way to the Middle East, where Middle Eastern metallurgists start building cannon. Now, there's an argument that China had cannon, but not in the way that looks like modern. That's gonna affect the battlefields of Europe in the coming centuries. That's kind of a Middle Eastern invention, an Ilkhanate invention, Persian and Turkish and Egyptian. So you get this mixtures of culture and knowledge. It ended the old world systems, which allowed new systems to rise. The Black Death is going to give rise to a capitalism in Europe, where you could sell your labor for a profit for the first time. You could leave your farm. That the Lord was not the most powerful guy around. Because so many people died. There was such a need for labor that you could move, you could leave, you could spread out, you could get your own farm because now it was depopulated. You could start over. So wages go up, incomes go up, life expectancy starts to go up. And they created early concepts of nationalism as a form of independence from the Mongols. We get this in Russia. The Russian national kind of origin story. Of course, the Russians are older than this, but kind of the Russia begins is in the Alexander Nevsky's revolt against the Mongols, against the Turks, the Golden Horde, the Turkish Mongols. You get the same thing in Ming China. We are never going to be conquered again. In some ways, you get the same thing in the Ottoman Turks. That we will run Turkish. We will become powerful enough to not only conquer the Byzantine Empire, not only beat up some Europeans, but also the Golden Horde as well will be allied to them. We will be the senior Turk rather than them. The Persians create a Persian Sassafid empire that breaks away, that becomes like Athena out of the head of Zeus, comes out of the Ilkhanate and Timur's empire of destruction, comes a Persian, Iranian empire that isn't going to be conquered by the Ottoman, that isn't going to be run by Arabs the way it was during the caliphates. No, it's going to be an Iranian empire, an Iranian government. So you get these early concepts of nationalism. This is not the nationalism of the French Revolution. This is not modern nationalism, but it's also the nationalism of we are not Mongols. We are different from you, and we should be separate from you. We should be independent of you. And so, what is more national? What is more modern than a bit of capitalism, a bit of nationalism, gunpowder, right? I mean, when you talk modern, when you talk modernity, those are all of the things we're going to talk about. So, thank you very much for this listening. Be safe. Take care. I'll talk to you soon.